This episode of Detour Antarctica includes content related to mental health and suicide that may be upsetting to some listeners. If you need to talk to someone about issues discussed in this episode, please see the show notes on your podcast app for resources that may be of use. If Antarctica was a country, it would probably have the lowest crime rate on Earth. With a seasonal summer population of around 5,000, the average Antarctican is highly educated and motivated. The employment rate is 100% by virtue of everyone in the continent having been brought there with a specific role or expertise. In most cases, you'll not only have to have written a PhD to end up on the ice, but also be top of your field. A research position in the frozen south is a prestigious thing. And although living conditions are tough, researchers would do anything not to jeopardize their place. For some, it's the pinnacle of a scientific career. The result is a crime rate that will put Switzerland and Singapore to shame. There are no police, no prisons, not so much as a drunk tank in the whole continent. Sounds almost utopian. However, there are many reasons beyond a low crime rate why there is no law enforcement in Antarctica. It would be naive to think that in the 120 years of permanent settlement there has never been a need for them. In December 2000, a curious case landed at the Christchurch coroner's office. The body of a researcher had returned from Antarctica for autopsy. It was determined he had been poisoned. Conducted 6 months after the fact, after a long winter over, his colleagues had long since left the country and could not be brought back for questioning. Was this Antarctica's first cold case murder? Antarctica is the last place on Earth to be reached by humans. So how is it so difficult to say who got there first? And why does everyone want a slice of what seems to be the world's most inhospitable continent? My name is Thomas Bywater. In March 2020, while stranded on a ship in the Drake Passage, I had the opportunity to meet some of the adventurous characters drawn to Antarctica and learn some of its surprising episodes. Stories of archaeological hoaxes, murders in a continent without police, and a research station baby boom. In the span of just 200 years, the 7 countries with claims and permanent footholds at the bottom of the world have developed rich, sometimes contradictory histories, New Zealand amongst them. This podcast aims to explore some of these episodes and see if Antarctica's short history could go back further than first thought. This is Detour Antarctica. Antarctica has never recorded a murder, but not for lack of attempts. It was just before dawn, at the end of 6 months of darkness, when Sergei Savitsky snapped. Part of the skeleton crew of just 13 left behind during the dark season, there was nowhere to hide on Russia's Bellinghausen base. The 54-year-old electrician had been sparring with his colleague, Oleg, all the way through winter. It was in the crew mess that the incident happened. Oleg had been taunting Sergei and said something particularly inflammatory. Possibly the ending of the paperback novel Sergei was trying to hide behind. According to some station workers, it could have been more simple than that, but it was enough. He put down the book for a knife. Lunging at Oleg, Sergei stabbed him repeatedly in the torso. Rushed to a Chilean army hospital for treatment, Oleg survived his injuries. The remote network of bases are prepared for all kinds of medical emergencies, but murderous crew members are not something they had expected. The question of what to do with Sergei, who had just stuck a knife into his colleague, was a pressing one. The electrician was repentant, but there was no way to return him to Russia for trial. There are, of course, no courts and no jails in Antarctica. The nearest Russian police constable was 15,000 kilometers away. It would all have to wait. Sergei would have to remain in the place where he committed the crime until the next airlink out. He couldn't very well escape. He remained under house arrest in the Russian Orthodox chapel for 10 days until a resupply plane arrived on the 20th of October. Russian press noted that Sergei flew back home to St. Petersburg without an escort. Asking him why he turned himself in, Sergei was quoted in saying, "Nobody needs a man wielding a knife in Antarctica." There have been 2 prior attempted murders on the continent. One happened in 1996 at the US-operated McMurdo station. A cook took a swing at 2 of his colleagues in the mess kitchen using a claw hammer. The previous incident happened at what was the Soviet-Russian Vostok station in 1959. The incident occurred between two researchers involving an extremely tense game of chess and an ice axe. Chess is still banned from Russian bases to this day. Closer to home, in 2015, the US National Science Foundation, based out of Christchurch, reported that alcohol was a contributing factor to 3/4 of disciplinary actions handed out on their bases. The 40 criminal and civil cases launched by the USAP that year ranged from fraud and plagiarism to indecent exposure and being drunk on the job. Like the continent itself, the closer you look, the less pristine white it appears. But there has never been a murder. At least, never one recorded. The setting of John Carpenter's The Thing was a stroke of genius. Overwintering on an Antarctic research base, the film captures a unique claustrophobia. Outside, a deadly frozen waste. Inside, the uncertainty that one of your colleagues is a shape-shifting murderer. It's high camp 80s horror, but miles away from the experience of most scientists. Yes, it's the coldest continent in the world, but indoors is pretty hospitable. The standard field season runs from October to February. Living on the ice with colleagues for a little over 4 months, most teams are pretty close. In Scott Base, you need to be able to get along, to make your own entertainment. In fact, Antarcticans love to party.
It was one of the events that pretty much the whole base got involved in. No photos are shared from this night, no stories are shared from this night, but I know that it's definitely one that everyone fully gets into, and everyone's just really relaxed. A whole lot of people come in from McMurdo, so it's a shared party, so it's Scott Base and McMurdo. At the end of it, they crown a Mr. Ross Island.
Annika Andresen was a Blake Trust Scholar in 2016. Spending a summer at Scott Base, she helped restore the heritage huts and some of the field research for the redevelopment. She came back with stories of seven-a-side rugby in the snow and ski expeditions to the Ross Island Hills. With 24 hours of summer sun, Scott Base's occupants work hard and play hard. Antarctica is an inspirational otherworldly place. People dedicate their entire careers to trying to visit the continent. However, there is a 6-month-long dark side to Antarctica. It's a place of polar extremes, going from 24 hours of sunlight and a vibrant international community to a skeleton crew of scientists. The overwinter teams are caretakers for the world's longest night watch.
So there's a photo wall in Scott Base somewhere. I've had it described to me.
There is. They've taken the picture in a different location on the base. It's really nice because you kind of can see the team and a few of the characters' kind of stories come out in it. And it's really nice. They've got it right back from right at the start.
There is a 6-month-long dark season when the team of 86 shrinks down to just 12, and their world becomes the all-weather corridors of the overwinter buildings. The long winter manifests itself in different ways: brain fog, lethargy, and disorientation. The winter is the biggest challenge to teams on the ice. It is shown to disturb the circadian rhythm and hormonal balance of explorers. The difference between summer and winter deployments is stark. It's far more than night and day. It was the winter of 2000 at the South Pole Station. Rodney Marks was one of the astrophysicists overwintering at the base. A tall, skinny guy from Geelong, Victoria, with pink shoulder-length hair. He played guitar in the station band, fanny pack in the Big Nancy Boys, and manned the southernmost radio telescope in the world. He was a consummate nerd. His colleagues describe him as a brilliant scientist with the grungy appearance of Kurt Cobain. Under that rock and roll exterior was a guy who got to work early, stayed late, and kept a tidy, organised lab. A scruffy, approachable guy who gave the impression of almost accidental brilliance. Right until the day he died, in the middle of the Winter Over research station, just a couple of 100 metres away from the geographic South Pole. On the 11th of May, he reported feeling unwell. Around 5 p.m, after the short walk between the remote observatory base, Marks went to bed early. It was shortly after 5 a.m. he woke, vomiting blood. Rushed to the station's medical bay, Dr. Thompson presumed this was stress-induced. He wouldn't be the first conscientious scientist to worry himself up a stomach ulcer. However, at 1 p.m, he returns to Biomed, reporting blurred vision and nausea. The station's Ectochem blood lab isn't working, which limits the doctor's line of inquiry. Concerned, Thompson tries to get a diagnosis via satellite link, but is not concerned enough to stop Marks discharging himself. 2 hours later, he's brought back in again, suffering breathing difficulty. Getting progressively worse, his friends try to resuscitate him. His breathing fails. His pulse fails. Within 36 hours of first symptoms, Marks was dead, killed by a mystery illness. Darren Schneider, the other Australian in the overwinter crew, had been keeping a journal of the events.
Rodney and I felt great for a few days. I last talked to him Wednesday evening and he seemed fine. On Friday he was worse and Sonia took the day off to make sure he was okay. And then on the Friday afternoon he was in biomed and the doc was looking after him. Late in the afternoon Sonia was with him. Rodney unexpectedly took his last breath. The trauma team was called immediately. We did everything we could, but Rodney didn't come back. He had friends around him at the end. We have no idea what happened.
Heart failure from an unknown cause was blamed. Unable to fly him off the continent until November, they could not determine a cause of death until spring, when the coroner could see him in Christchurch. Dr. Thompson is instructed to take samples. For a period, Marks is buried on the ice to preserve his body. Just 4 months into the overwinter, it's a low moment for this 50-person team. Behind them, the team left a pole marker, an Antarctic tradition, to keep track of the pole in the shifting ice. Dedicated to Rodney Marks, it was engraved with his favourite constellation, Scorpio, and the words, "Not without peril." But that was not the end of the story. It was the 19th of December when the cause of death was finally established, by which time the winter over crew had long since left Christchurch for Australia, the States, or back onto the ice of Antarctica. It was determined that Marks had died from methanol poisoning. This contradicted the original National Science Foundation report, which blamed Marks' death on natural causes. It also brought up a lot of ugly scenarios, which had never been considered. If Marks had been poisoned, how did it happen? He was a young, brilliant scientist with everything to live for, who died in mysterious circumstances. Why was an investigation being considered only now? Herald journalist David Fisher was reporting on the story, and it wasn't just the location of the case which struck him as odd.
Well, a coronial process can be fairly straightforward. It doesn't need to take, certainly doesn't need to take 8 years. The reason that it was so prolonged was because the United States put a lot of effort into blocking or attempting to control the investigation into Marks' death. The reasons why they did that are unclear. They're very protective of their scientific programs in Antarctica, and it could well be simply a reputational impact that they were trying to control. It's hard to know. They've never been particularly forthcoming.
Like Fisher, the original coronial investigation had come to the case very late, and with little cooperation from the authorities present. As an Australian citizen working for an American university on a US base operated by the National Science Foundation, somehow it came to Christchurch as a gateway to Antarctica to look into the mysterious death. When DSS Wormald came to the case, 6 months after the fact, none of the 48 personnel present that winter could be recalled to testify. Few of the authorities could be counted on to cooperate. As a point, the United States does not recognise New Zealand's claim in Antarctica. Any cooperation would have to be done on a voluntary basis as part of a non-criminal investigation, regardless of whatever facts the autopsy unveiled. All Wormald had were a few details known about Marks' final hours and his eventual cause of death. 150 millilitres of methanol, roughly half a Coke can of clear, colourless liquid. It's readily found and used as a cleaning fluid for instruments or antifreeze, but you're not going to drink it by mistake, especially in a lab.
I find that unlikely, given that he worked with methanol. He would have known it was dangerous. Even somebody that was in a situation where they were casual about what they might be drinking would be on high alert when in a laboratory where you knew that there were dangerous materials. And if he had done at the point that he started suffering problems with his vision, at the point that he became very unwell and started vomiting blood, I find it difficult to believe that he wouldn't at that point have said, "Oh, when I was working in the lab last night, I picked up an unmarked tumbler that had some liquid in it and I drank that. Maybe that's what the problem is. That wasn't something that he ever raised.
So could he have drunk poison intentionally?
There was no evidence that suggested that he may have been contemplating suicide or that he was in a depressive state. And if that were the case, that he was able to shield suicidal ideation from those around him and went ahead to do that, choosing methanol as a way to take your own life seems a very unlikely way of going about it, because it led to 36 hours of excruciating pain.
The fact that he sought help from the doctor several times and said nothing about methanol would seem to counter this theory.
So that leaves the third option, which is that it wasn't something that he did to himself, but something that somebody else did to him. And as a solution, that has some appeal because he was silent on what it was that was causing the pain and the problems that he was having. It suggests that he was unaware of it. It's hard to see what sort of a prank it would have been. If it was somebody that was aware it was methanol, it's not very funny to do that to somebody. That's the poorest form of bad joke.
I think the method of poisoning and the fact that it's methanol, underlines a lot, or outrules a lot of the these three theories of whether it's an accident or self-inflicted or foul play or murder, or, as you say, a prank. It seems that it's something which is pretty common, as you say, for cleaning scientific equipment, or it's a pretty unpleasant way to die and not very funny as a prank, and you wouldn't choose to do that to yourself, you'd imagine. But then again, if you wanted it to be accidental, it is very slow and hard to detect. If you wanted it to appear like an accident, then...
Well, there was never a formal homicide investigation launched. I took the view that the evidence that was gathered for the coronial process pointed very much or made it very likely that there was another person involved in the death of Rodney Marks. Whether that was deliberate or something that happened by accident, we don't know.
There's obviously a drug culture, or there's a culture of drinking, at least, which he and his colleagues admitted to. But there's not a possibility that they could have been making Antarctic moonshine gone wrong.
I find it interesting to think of the environment in which these people worked, because they are exceptional. 50 people, 10 of whom are scientists out of the whole world, that get to go and live in a place like this and do the things that they do there. Exceptional circumstances and exceptional people tend to create their own culture and their own rules to guide that culture. While there was a prohibition on the part of the US program against drugs and some quite clear procedures around or guidelines around drinking, there was a real party culture there. People drank, and they drank heavily at times. They had a tradition of manufacturing their own booze.
There is a drinking culture in Antarctic bases that is as eccentric as any other part of their culture, which is a challenge, given alcohol, like everything else, is rationed in the remote stations. The brilliant, sometimes bored minds, faced with a lack of rum rations, will turn to extremes to supplement alcohol supplies. Home brewing and distilling are popular pastimes at the pole. The result of this is toast juice. Reading from the diary of the Seoul New Zealand Overwinter crew member.
It became pretty obvious early on in the season that some kinds of alcoholic beverage would not last the entire season. Those of us who were rather passionate about our love for Speight's Old Dark Malt Ale are looking down the barrel of only 4 cases left as I write. Luckily, we decided back in June to revive the South Pole winter over tradition of home brewing, or as it gets called down here, dome brew. We affectionately named it Old Sock for the distinct aroma.
Getting toasty, or just toast, is base slang for cabin fever. The antidote for this they created in the form of lab-grade ethanol spirits. Distilling it on site, the researchers went as far as to bottle the stuff, making printed labels, in bold black and white fonts.
Toast is such a way of life here at the Pole that last year they even distilled a spirit and named it Toast Juice. It's a clear alcohol with a triple figure proof. By the taste of it, I'm sure it's not far from being almost pure ethyl alcohol.
Marks was a self-confessed binge drinker. Diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, he admitted to friends and colleagues that he would often drink to soften the symptoms. However, he was not unusual in his heavy use of alcohol at the base. Now, tainted alcohol is a familiar danger of home distilling. Methanol is a common byproduct, which if correctly distilled, is removed from spirits. But it's a dangerous substance that in a best-case scenario is the cause of a bloody awful hangover. At worst, is fatal, or sends the drinker blind. As little as 10 millilitres can cause permanent organ damage. Trace methanol is common in moonshine. In drinking spirits, the effects can be diluted, but you don't distill 150 millilitres of pure methanol by accident.
A possibility, like the others. If he was in a situation where he was drinking toast juice and nothing but toast juice, if he was in a situation where he was the only one that was drinking toast juice because nobody else suffered the symptoms that he did, if he was in a situation where toast juice that had been made badly with methanol was the only thing that he drank, then possibly. But the evidence that came through in the coronial process was not evidence that pointed to Marks being a solitary drinker. It wasn't evidence that suggested that his use of alcohol was constant in the sense of an alcoholic. It was drinking that happened with one or more people. It tended to be in a social situation. If Marks was in a social situation when he ingested toast juice that had methanol in it, one would have thought that others would have had that as well. It's a possibility, but it poses as many difficulties and as many puzzles as the other possibilities do.
But, obviously the method is pretty clear or the cause of death. Do you have any leads on what the motive would be, or that's long gone in history? Or
the difficulty about the investigation that New Zealand Police Detective Grant Wormold carried out was, there were numerous difficulties with the investigation. The first being that if it were the scene of a crime, it was a scene that by the time spring rolled around, it had been cleared away. Rodney Marks died in May. It wasn't until October that his body was taken out. That's months and months of time during which any physical evidence that might have existed at the base was done away with. Of the 50 people that were there, the 50 people, one of whom I think would know the answer to what happened to Rodney Marks, it was only possible to get information from 11 of those people.
There are several loose ends that only make this case more mysterious. The drinking culture in the South Pole base was well known, notorious in fact, but there were signs that there was a culture of harder drugs that base workers were less likely to write home about. The base's medic, Dr. Thompson, recorded needle wounds in Rodney's arm.
There were 2 needle marks on his right arm. Rodney Marks was right-handed, so it seems unlikely that he would have used his offhand to inject himself. Rodney Marks had previously, years before, used drugs intravenously. There's no suggestion that he did so as an addict, that it was rather more for recreational purposes. And he hadn't done that for some time other than in Christchurch at a party before he flew down to Antarctica. It's intriguing because Rodney Marks was in a scene where there were drugs available that were used intravenously, which is not common. It's a very small user group. It's an interesting thought as to how he would have come into contact with that user group, being a visitor from outside New Zealand, passing through Christchurch on the way to Antarctica, which suggests to me that it was probably somebody connected to that Antarctica community.
These needle marks were discovered on the first call into Biomed while Rodney was still lucid. Thompson reported to the coroner that they were fresh, not older than 3 to 5 days recent. He reported confronting Rodney about the freshness of these needle wounds, and that the patient had known the gravity of what he was insinuating.
Perhaps there was someone or others that were on that same winter rover that had the same taste for this that he did. Raises the possibility that he was in a place where he was going to be able to access drugs that are used intravenously and to take those to Antarctica so that they could be used down there for that purpose.
There were reports of the reek of cannabis smoke following workers around base. One colleague testified to finding a plant growing inside the Astro telescope apparatus where Rodney worked. The fact that personnel were shipping cannabis plants through New Zealand to the South Pole base was an embarrassing revelation, but the possibility that harder substances could be reaching Antarctica was something else. Despite the needle tracks in Rodney's arm and his confession of historic drug use, Rodney was clean.
There's a real puzzle about why there were needle marks in his arm, because there were no drugs found in his system. I wondered whether the needle marks were there because he thought it was going to be drugs that were injected, but it wasn't. Yeah, it's quite a puzzle.
The drip feed of new, maddening details had changed the case. It was unrecognisable to the conditions under which witnesses were questioned when they first left the ice regarding the death of a colleague under natural causes. Now, there was an unexplained poisoning, alleged drug use within the base, and the only people who had been with Rodney in those final hours had long since left the country. It wasn't until 2005 that the US's National Science Foundation was asked to contact the overwinter team with regards to the methanol poisoning. Contacting the NSF via the police attaché of the New Zealand Washington Embassy, there was a formal request made for more information and to requisition those who spent the winter with Rodney.
Letter Police Attaché, Washington Embassy, legal letter. The line of questioning would be the activities of Rodney in days around the 11th May 2000 and the social culture that prevailed at the base during the 2000 season,
as they euphemistically put it. Although they were very clear that no criminal investigation is being handled at the time. The correspondence is a careful diplomatic dance, but the National Science Foundation's reply was a lot less diplomatic. Carl A. Erb, director of the Polar Programme at the time, wrote back, taking particular disapproval at what was being implied by the remark on prevailing social culture. It's a reply reminiscent of the scene in Casablanca where Humphrey Bogart gets dressed down by an unscrupulous gendarme. I'm shocked to hear that there is a culture of drinking in Antarctica. In their reply, the NSF said, as far as they were concerned, their own investigations had been concluded, after a great deal of time and effort, and that a line should now be drawn underneath the incident, for Mark's memory's sake. It would appear to be a fair and rational plea, had this not been the first time the coronial inquest had been informed of the existence of such a report. As DSS Wormald informed Erb that the NSF had been asked to supply all their material relating to the case, so it was a surprise to learn of a new analysis. To which Erb replied,
"We are confused about the coroner's goals. Our reports deal only with the medical aspects of the case in an effort to determine the cause of death and whether any action to protect other personnel at South Pole Station was required, and therefore of little value to your inquiry."
Later, a request for these documents under the Freedom of Information Act returned the confusing response that no such reports existed. The Foundation did, however, agree to send out the 42 questions to former colleagues of Marks, providing that the NSF had the final say on the questions asked, and on the condition that cooperation was completely voluntary. All questions were delivered by the 12th of December 2005, although, talking to Mark's colleagues, some of them didn't get the questions until 6 months later. Others had to get in contact with Wormald directly to get a copy of the questionnaire, after learning about its existence from colleagues. Even for this conscientiousness, the response rate was extremely low. The reason for this failure to get a response and the ensuing unsatisfying investigation could not be landing squarely at the foot of any one organisation. This was the early 2000s. The internet was a thing. Many of Rodney's colleagues continued to work for their respective agencies, some still visiting for seasons in Antarctica, you don't need the NSF or their contractors and a voluntary questionnaire to find people and ask them questions. Having exhausted attempts to get further information from the Foundation and polar contractors Raytheon, the coronial hearing was ended in 2008. It was deemed inconclusive. Wormald had left the investigation with a feeling that there was still more to cover, but there was a lack of willingness to look for it. It might seem too high conspiratorial, but was this unsatisfactory investigation and lack of cooperation based on broader political principles? The US does not officially recognise the New Zealand Antarctic claim, which makes operating two bases there, McMurdo and Amundsen Scott, extremely inconvenient. To say nothing of the US Antarctic programme being based out of Christchurch, turning over the lead of a high-profile investigation to New Zealand might set a dangerous precedent, or worse, it might lead to them having to recognise the New Zealand claim. Had the investigation been undermined from the start by the very location in which it took place?
It's not extraordinary. There are a number of incidents like that through the annals of recent Antarctic history. So the basic proposition is that New Zealand criminal law applies in the Ross Dependency. Australian criminal law applies within the Australian Antarctic Territory. However, the treaty neutralises the application of that law to anyone else other than New Zealand citizens in the case of the Ross Dependency.
An expert in maritime and polar law, Dr. Donald Rothwell is familiar with the unique legal arrangements that cover Antarctica.
And what you see are considerable variations in terms of how stringent they are in terms of seeking to apply those relevant laws. Now, for New Zealand and Australia, that's very troubling because ultimately, at the end of the day, Australia and New Zealand are still trying to protect their sovereignty over their relevant claimed areas. One element of demonstrating that you're exercising your sovereignty is quite obviously applying your criminal law in the same way that a person can be charged with a criminal offence in Christchurch through the application of New Zealand criminal law, but they can't necessarily be quite as easily charged with New Zealand criminal law at the McMurdo base in the Ross Dependency. So that's why these issues are quite troubling for parliamentarians, but also governments in Wellington and Canberra. But as I said, it's not extraordinary. It has happened in the past, and there's no easy way around it given the provisions of the treaty.
The US Department of State is quite clear on its stance.
7 countries, Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom, maintain territorial claims in Antarctica. But the United States and most other countries do not recognize those claims. While the United States maintains a basis to claim territory in Antarctica, it has not made a claim.
New Zealand's special relationship comes with these special considerations. As a continent set aside for peaceful cooperation and science, historic ownership is a moot point. It's easy to overlook differences at the interpretations of the treaty. Most research there is done through international programs, regardless of whose flag flies over which base. However, it could be seen that the decade-long Marks case was a victim of inflexibility in the Antarctic Treaty. The University of Canterbury's Karen Scott wrote, "It's not beyond the realm of speculation to suggest that US authorities were concerned that providing information on activities in the bases in the Ross Dependency might be interpreted as a recognition, or at least acknowledgement, of New Zealand's claim."
Rodney Marks' death is still, I think, the only suspicious death to have occurred in Antarctica and the only potential homicide to have occurred there.
When I asked David Fisher, he definitely saw a motive for a cover-up, but not from Antarctic treaty parties.
One of the things that bedeviled the Rodney Marks situation was the relationship between that US agency as the employer and the 50 people that went down there. A lot of people that go to Antarctica do so year after year. They'll have a number of trips down there and possibly a number of winters over. If they are in a situation of relying on a particular employer to support them to do that, and that employer doesn't want to be involved or to be as cooperative, I might hope in the type of investigation Rodney Marks' death, then that's a tremendous incentive for people to not share what they might know. If there is a cover-up here, then that's at the root of that. The disincentive for those witnesses to tell what happened, what actually did happen to Rodney Marks. Of those 50 people that were down there, I'm sure that there is at least one person that knows the answer. For that one person to be able to speak the truth that they know is an incredibly difficult thing.
Perhaps the difficulty of the long-suffering case had less to do with high politics and more to do with the unwillingness for a national Antarctic program to have their dirty laundry aired in the courts of another country. In 2015, a damning safety audit by the US Office of the Inspector General deemed that a culture of alcohol abuse on USAP bases had led to fights, indecent exposure, and employees arriving to work under the influence. Even with the use of breathalyzers and remedial measures suggested, it's hard to imagine that Antarctica's culture will change, or that it was much different 20 years ago.
The case of Rodney Marks was one that threatened to expose a culture that the US employer had known about for years and done nothing about, and that made them intensely uncomfortable.
If you've got something to hide, an empty continent of 40 million square kilometres of ice is as good a place as any. But are some secrets too big to bury? You have been listening to Detour Antarctica. This podcast has been written and voiced by me, Thomas Bywater. Each episode has been mixed and engineered by Tash Chittock, with special thanks to Ethan Sills, Francis Cook, Steph Holmes, Andrew Laxon, David Rowe and Nadia Tolich. This series wouldn't have been possible without the translation of Damien Venuto, an input from the experts and scientists that call Antarctica home. David Fisher, Donald Rothwell, and the friends and colleagues of Rodney Marks. For imagery, details, and Herald Premium content on the Antarctic stories we covered, and to find more podcasts like this one, go to nzherald.co.nz or listen on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.